Today we're sewing up something bold, playful, and oh so fun from Matchy Matchy Sewing Club. This Colorblock pattern expands on the craft studio tee we already know and love, but with a modern twist. A cheerful checkerboard design and 3 playful views to choose from. Whether you're in the mood for a cropped Colorblock tee, a sweet peplum top, or a breezy mini dress, this pattern is all about effortless style and joyful making. It's beginner-friendly, super versatile, and comes together quickly. I'm using 3 vibrant summer cloud linens from Matchy Matchy, raspberry fizz and sugar mint for the bodice, and a pop of Firefly for the cuffs and bias-bound neckline. These colors pop and make the checkerboard really shine. Since the front and back are identical, I've marked the wrong side of my fabrics with noted pieces of tape, just to keep things organized. You can also use the handy cutouts provided with the pattern to pin to your pieces for extra clarity. So choose your favorite colors, clear your table, and let's start stitching up something bright, happy, and totally you. To prevent the curved necklines from overstretching as we work with our project, we're going to stay stitch. Sew along the curve with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat to stay stitch the neckline for both front upper body pieces as well as both back upper body pieces. The front and back bodice pieces will be constructed in the same way. Begin by placing the left and right top bodice pieces right sides together and pinning the center seam. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together. I've pressed my seam allowance toward the lighter fabric. Then we're going to top stitch from the right side of the fabric on the lighter side, catching that seam allowance as we go with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we'll place our left and right bottom bodice pieces right sides together along the center seam and pin in place. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, then press your seam allowance toward the lighter fabric. Now we'll top stitch the seam allowance in the same way as we did for the top bodice pieces, sewing along the lighter side of the fabric and catching that seam allowance as we go from top to bottom, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Along the top raw edge of the bottom bodice piece, we're going to sew basting stitches from one side to the other. Start and stop your stitches 3/4 of an inch away from the outer edges. And leave tails of thread on both sides so you have tails to pull for gathering. We'll sew 2 rows of basting stitches, one with a 1/4 inch seam allowance straight across. Then once we've sewn that set of stitches and left our tails, we'll start a fresh set of stitches with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, remembering to start and stop our stitches 3/4 of an inch away from the outer raw edge. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, leaving thread tails at the opposite end. Before we begin the gathering, place the top and bottom bodice pieces right sides together, aligning the center seam, and pin at the center point. Now we'll begin pulling our basting stitches to gather the bottom bodice piece. Once the bottom bodice fits the top bodice piece and the gathers are distributed evenly, pin them together. Repeat to gather the opposite side of the bodice. Sew the top and bottom bodice pieces together straight across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together. Then press your seam up toward the top bodice piece. From the right side of the garment, you can now remove any visible basting stitches. Repeat all of these steps to create your opposite bodice piece. Then we'll place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams and pin in place. Sew both of the shoulder seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together as we've done previously. Then press these seam allowances toward the back of the garment. Now we'll pin our side seams from the underarm to the bottom of the garment on both sides. Sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press the seams toward the back of the garment. Fold your cuff piece right sides together, align the short edges and pin in place. Sew the short edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Then we'll fold the cuff piece in half, wrong sides together, and give that a good press. Repeat to create both cuffs. Here is my bodice turned inside out, and we're going to begin attaching the cuff. Place the cuff and the armhole right sides together, align the seam of the cuff with the bottom of the armhole. Continue pinning the cuff in place. Sew the cuff into the armhole with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together. Press the cuff toward the outside of the garment and press its seam allowance toward the inside of the garment. From the outside, we'll top stitch our seam allowance in place all the way around with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat to attach both cuffs to your bodice. Fold and press your binding 1/3 of the width to the wrong side. Then roll and press an additional 1/3 of the width. Now that I have that pressed, I'll open out my creases, and the lines that we've pressed into the bias tape will help us with our sewing as we move forward. Starting at the center back, place the bias tape and the neckline right sides together and pin all the way around without stretching the bias tape. Once you've pinned all the way around and you're back at the center back, allow the short ends of the bias tape to overlap the starting point by a 1/2 of an inch. Trim off any excess if necessary. Then we'll place the edges of the bias tape right sides together and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam of the bias tape open, then we're going to sew around the neckline to attach the bias tape with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which should fall right in line with the outermost crease that we pressed into the bias tape. Fold the binding up and away from the neckline and over its seam allowance. Understitch the binding by sewing the binding to the seam allowance underneath, with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around. Fold the outermost fold of the bias tape to the inside of the garment so that it covers the main seam allowance. This folding of the bias tape should fall in line with your outermost crease that we press with the iron. Fold the bias tape and the seam allowance once more to the inside along the main neckline seam. Continue to fold your bias tape to the inside of the neckline in the same way all the way around. You can also add a garment label at this time, tucking it underneath the bias tape at the center back and pinning in place. Once the bias tape is pinned in place all the way around, edge stitch close to the bottom inner fold of the bias tape with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the neckline. To hem the bottom of the garment, fold the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch, then roll and press an additional 1/2 of an inch, all the way around. I've pressed and pinned my rolled hem all the way around the bottom of the garment. Now I'm ready to edge stitch in place all the way around, sewing with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the upper inner fold all the way around. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.